Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest video. This diorama is called Planet 8. I've been wanting to do a sci-fi scene for a while now, and this one was a lot of fun to work on. It created a lot of creative and engineering challenges, but in the end, I think it turned out okay. Alright, let's go and take a look at how this thing was made, and don't forget to hang around until the end to see the final shots. Alright, let's go. With all my dioramas, I have a picture of what I want the finished scene to look like before I start. Basically, I know what I want the diorama to look like, and then I try to build what my mind can see. What initially inspired me to make this scene was the idea of metal panels reflecting light that's coming in from a window with a planet in the background. The interior will be formed by metal panels, and here are some examples of the panel designs I played with. I had to be careful not to make the designs too fancy because I would need to use a design that I could cut out with the tools available to me. At this stage, I've also locked in the scale and dimensions of the interior. In this case, I settled on about 1/18 scale as my guide for any of the elements that needed scaling. Next, I created a scale correct template of the front and one of the side panels. This step isn't totally necessary, but it gives me something to reference as I'm building. Right from the start, I wanted to work with aluminium sheets for the interior panels. I'm using 0.5mm sheets that I picked up from the hardware store. In hindsight, it might have been way easier to use 0.2mm aluminium, but I settled on the 0.5 because of its rigidity. In experimenting initially, I found that the 0.2mm aluminium bent and crumpled a little bit too easily for what I was going to be using it for. My friend for this part was the good old Stanley knife. I had to replace the blades fairly regularly, and I think I used about 10 blades in this project. Working with aluminium sheets is a bit like working with styrene. I scored each side of the sheet and then wobbled the two halves until they snapped. The hardest part was trying to get those millimeter perfect sides and angles that I would need to make the panels look convincing. And I have to admit that I recut quite a few of the panels that are in the final diorama. Now the two side panels have an angled top and bottom. To make the angles, I scored the back of the panel where the bend would go, then carefully bent the score mark over the edge of a table. Let's leave the panel cutting alone for a bit because something I've ordered online has just arrived in the mail. These are the parts that make up the digital screen. I bought a small LCD screen that's a good size for this diorama. The screen was originally housed in this case, but I don't need it for the diorama, so I'm going to remove the case. The screen is also just a little bit too tall for the scale I want, so I'll be masking about 1/4 of the screen, which you'll see later. Lastly, the screen is going to be connected to a Raspberry Pi, which will play the video loop from an SD card. At this point, I've cut all the panels and it's time to attach them to a base. I wanted a dark but reflective layer to show between the panel joins, so I've chosen a sheet of glossy black acrylic. In hindsight though, I realised I didn't really need to use the acrylic as I'm not sure it adds anything to the finished diorama. Just one of those things that us hobbyists do to add some unnecessary hours to a project. Okay, it's time to stick the panels down to the acrylic, and at this point I was a little bit nervous about using glue just in case I needed to reposition or move a panel later. So I settled on using double-sided tape for the job. It turned out that I did pull off a few panels to reposition them, so I'm glad I went with the tape and not the CA glue. Here I'm making sure my angles line up before I drop the panel down. The only downside to using the tape was its inflexibility to position when down. At least with glue, you get some valuable seconds to get the position right. The tape forms such a strong bond that I actually damaged some of the panels when I was taking them off to reposition them, so they had to be recut. After a while, I ended up eyeballing the last panels, but to begin with, I used a piece of scrap metal as a spacer for the panel lines. and here's one side panel finished. The other side was made in exactly the same way. Again, in hindsight, I should have used a thinner acrylic because the window area was impossible for me to cut out as one shape. So I've had to cut multiple pieces that I'm going to stick to a foam board backing. The front panel was the trickiest because it had more angles to line up, but I was on a roll after completing the two side panels, so I was able to finish this part fairly quickly. Now I just need to cut away the foam board from the window and to file some of the excess acrylic away. So here are the final panels, left and right sides, the front window panel, and the floor and ceiling panels. For the next stage, I need to make an inside rim for the window. This will serve to cover the foam board, but to also hide the external parts of the digital display. I cut and bent 4 pieces of aluminium strips, which I've attached with super glue. I really did breathe a sigh of relief after this part because it was going to be the last stage of working with the metal, and I was also relieved that the lines and angles look okay. After that, I attached all the panels to foam board. Here I'm adding some pieces of tube to the ceiling. Not totally necessary, but I didn't want the floor and ceiling panels to look exactly the same. I didn't record a lot of this part because I was conscious of boring you with too many aluminium cutting scenes, but here's the housing for the digital display. The inside window section was a bit tricky, and there was a lot of filing done to get the finished shape, but I'm happy with how it turned out. Okay, it's time to put the display into the housing, and you can see that I've only framed part of the display. The excess and external components will be masked by the window frame. And now we can link up the panels and complete the interior of the diorama. And slide in the display. Now this is why I always join my interiors with tape. On contemplation, I thought the interior needed some details. This was one of those decisions that as a hobbyist you think, man, I want to do this, but it could make or break the whole thing. Because I'd be using paint over metal, there would be no Control Z if I didn't like the result. Anyway, I was determined that the interior needed this detail, so I made some stencils to mask the primer coat, followed by a yellowish top coat. When that was finished, I thought this step was worth it because it added some detail and colour to the interior. Now that I'm thinking about details, I'm adding some holes to the corners of each panel. Here I'm scuffing up the floor around where I think people would stand around the digital display. I'm not sure if this will show in the final piece, but I enjoy working with these small details. I was originally going to just cover the window area with some clear acrylic, but then I started thinking about the theme of the diorama and its story, and I thought it might be cool to have a cracked window instead. So I originally experimented with cracking the acrylic, which looked okay, but I thought the scale of the cracks in the acrylic were a little bit too large. I have some old cracked screen protectors, and looking at these, I think that the cracks in the screen protectors scale really well in miniature. So I bought some cheap iPad screen protectors to see if I could recreate this effect. I didn't record the entire process because I was outside wearing a mask and glasses, and I don't know if I can recommend this process due to the obvious safety hazards, but I think I got the effect I was looking for. To hold the broken screen protector in place, I attached it to a sheet of clear acrylic. Okay, now that I'm fairly sure that I won't need to alter the interior of the diorama any further, I'm ready to hard seal the interior panels together. To give the interior a rigid base, I'm attaching it to a thin sheet of MDF. Here's a view from the back, where you can see where the chips and cords for the display drape down and are hidden by the rim of the window. Now I can attach the broken window. I've added some wood strips for the acrylic to be attached to, and I've used a combination of super glue and double-sided tape to stick it down. Here's the backlit image that will go behind the window. The image is going to be attached to this sheet of light diffusing acrylic. I made the image in Photoshop and printed it onto a transparency sheet. Just backing up a bit here, I experimented with having the distant stars printed as part of the overall image, but I found they looked a little bit washed out, so instead I'm using a pin tool to make small holes in the sheet where the light should shine through, and I think this makes them more vibrant. Between building, I've been spending time using After Effects to create the digital display. I created the display to add some drama and interest to the scene, and I've tried to give a sense that the ship has taken damage and the screen is beginning to glitch. I didn't want to have too much colour in the display, so I've gone with a monotone green colour scheme. And the good thing is, because this is just a movie file running from an SD card, I can modify and change the video anytime I like. As always, I've made a box for the diorama, so I can slide the diorama in and the final steps can be completed. With the interior now inside the box, I noticed that you can see off the edges of the planet image when viewing the diorama from the sides. To get around this, I'm making a screen out of scrap aluminium left over from the panels. I'm hoping this will look like it's just part of the outside of the spaceship. I'm hoping it may also add some extra glints of light here and there from outside the window. And here I'm attaching them just behind the line of the window frame because I don't want them to look like they're part of the window. In this shot, you can see that I've reinforced the window with a strip of balsa. I did this because the original adhesion was beginning to sag. Alright, I think we're getting there. At this stage of the diorama, I like to leave it alone and just look at it for a day or two before I finally seal it up. I was now thinking that the interior was a little bit too empty, and I wanted to add something that would add interest and also help to tell the story of a hasty evacuation. So I printed and cut out some small pieces of paper and glued them randomly around the interior. Now I'm using artistic license here because I'm sure that there wouldn't be a lot of paper printouts being used in the far future, but heck, I'm going with it. I think a scattering of papers would add some needed clutter to the almost clinical interior and help sell the point that this spaceship was recently inhabited, but whoever was last here left in a real hurry. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with that decision. The bits of paper also break up the hard panel lines here and there, which I think is quite effective. Okay, back you go, buddy. Now the backlit picture can be slid into place. The lamp I've chosen to light the image is a USB LED light that I bought from IKEA. It's small but gives off the right amount of illumination. Here I've rigged up a scrap piece of wood that I'll attach the lamp to. I also contemplated adding a frosted panel between the window and the planet. I like the way this softened the background and added a slight blurred effect. But I also know that there is no atmosphere in space to create this effect, so I didn't add it to the final diorama. Alright, now I'm ready for the frame to go on. I wanted to address a comment I've received recently. I don't use any kind of special glass in my frames, and if you've noticed that a lot of my final shots are devoid of reflections, it's because I removed the glass to get some of these shots. Otherwise, you'd be distracted by my reflection or that of my messy work area. As soon as filming is finished, the glass will go back in and I'll glue on the frame. And finally, the cables are sorted out and the display can be connected to the Raspberry Pi. Alright, let's dim the room lights and see what this thing looks like with its lights on. As always, thank you so much for watching and I hope you enjoyed this sci-fi build. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found it. Alright, I'm off to make another diorama, so I'll catch you all in the next video.